Okay, so get ready because today we're going to be diving into illusions
Oh, wow.
and how our brains basically construct reality
Yeah.
by cracking open sensation and perception by E. Bruce Goldstein.
Okay.
Pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Really interesting stuff about how our senses really work.
It's funny. We kind of take our senses for granted.
Right.
We just assume what we see, what we hear, what we touch, it's accurate, like an accurate reflection of the world out there.
Yeah.
But this book really pulls back the curtain
Yeah.
and shows how much our brains are actually creating that reality.
Yeah, it's like we're not just passively absorbing information.
Right.
Our brain is like actively building this whole sensory experience.
Yeah.
It's pretty wild.
It's what?
Goldstein kind of starts out by explaining that we don't actually experience the world directly,
Right.
but through these like representations that are created by our senses.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily the real thing. It's really our brain's interpretation.
It's our interpretation of it.
Yeah.
It's like our brains are interpreting a coded message from our senses.
Okay.
And it reminds me of that allegory of the cave by Plato.
Oh, yeah.
Where the prisoners in the cave mistake shadows on the wall for reality. Like we only see the shadows, like the sensory signals, right?
Right.
And then it's up to our brain to decode them.
Okay, got it.
And so that's where things get really interesting because then it raises that mind-body problem. Like how do we go from these electrical signals zipping around our neurons, right?
To the actual experience of like seeing a vibrant color, feeling a cool breeze, or hearing a beautiful melody.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It's like, how does this activity turn into the feeling of a warm, fuzzy blanket or the smell of fresh-baked bread?
Right.
Like, how does that even happen?
It's a question that still has scientists and philosophers kind of scratching their heads.
I think so, yeah.
But to kind of like break it down a little bit, maybe we can start with sight.
Okay.
Probably our most dominant sense.
Sure.
Goldstein takes us on this journey inside the eye.
Okay.
Explains how light first enters through the cornea, then passes through the lens, which focuses the light onto the retina.
And that focusing process is called accommodation.
Okay.
And that's what allows us to see clearly at different distances.
Yeah, so it's like our eyes have a built-in autofocus.
Autofocus, exactly.
To keep things in sharp view.
Yeah.
And on the retina, we have those rods and cones,
right,
which contain those light-sensitive pigments.
Yeah.
And they convert light into the electrical signals that our brain can actually understand.
It's like they're translators.
Okay.
They're converting the language of light into the language of the brain.
Right.
But the catch is this translation process isn't always perfect.
Right.
Any problems with your cornea, your lens, like a flaw in a camera lens, is going to affect that final image.
Okay.
Even if your brain processing is flawless.
So we're literally seeing the world through the lens of our own biology.
Flaws and all.
Flaws and all.
That's kind of a profound thought when you think about it.
It is.
Speaking of how our biology shapes our vision, I thought it was really fascinating that our sensitivity to different colors actually changes in the dark.
Yeah.
Why is that?
That's thanks to the rods.
Okay.
They're much more sensitive in low light conditions.
Right.
And they're particularly attuned to blue-green wavelengths.
Okay.
So that's why things might look a little different at night. Our rods are calling the shots.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Now, these signals from the rods and cones, they don't travel to the brain in isolation.
Right.
Goldstein mentions this concept of neural convergence.
Yeah.
So multiple receptors converge or connect to a single neuron.
What does that mean for our vision?
Well, that convergence is actually why rods are more sensitive than cones.
Okay.
It's like pooling information.
Right.
So if any of the connected rods, they detect light, the neuron fires, making them really good for those low light situations.
Right.
However, it comes at a cost.
Uh-oh.
Lower acuity.
Okay.
Meaning they're not so great at seeing fine detail.
So it's a trade-off then. High sensitivity, but less detail.
Exactly.
It's like when you're trying to find your keys in a dimly lit room.
Right.
That peripheral vision relies more on those rods.
Right.
So you might pick up like a glint of metal, but you need to use like your central vision.
Right.
The fovea.
Yeah.
To really make out the details.
Exactly. The fovea, that central part of your retina, packed with cones. And it has much less convergence.
Okay.
So each cone there has a more direct line to the brain,
right,
giving us that sharp, detailed vision we need for things like reading or recognizing faces.
Right. So our eyes are kind of combining two different visual systems then.
Yeah.
One for sensitivity and one for detail.
Exactly.
That's really incredible when you think about it.
It is.
And what about babies? Their vision is still developing, right?
It is, yeah. And in fact, newborns have incredibly poor acuity.
Wow.
Because those cones are still developing and they're spaced farther apart than in adults.
Okay.
And get this.
Okay.
A newborn's fovea only captures about 2% of available light compared to 68% in adults.
2% versus 68%.
Yeah.
That's a huge difference.
Such a dramatic difference.
Wow.
And it explains why their vision undergoes such rapid development in those first few months of life.
It's amazing how quickly those neural connections form.
It is.
As babies start experiencing the world,
Yeah.
really highlights the plasticity of the brain.
For sure.
And how it's constantly adapting and rewiring itself based on experience.
It's not a static system at all.
Right.
And this leads us to the fascinating question of how the brain actually makes sense of all this visual input.
Okay.
How it decodes the signals from millions of rods and cones to create a coherent image.
Right. So we got all this raw data coming in. How
Yeah.
does the brain organize and interpret it all?
Yeah. Well, imagine the visual cortex, the part of the brain that processes vision like this incredibly intricate filing system.
Okay.
It's organized into these columns, each one responsible for processing a different aspect of the visual scene.
Okay.
So you've got location columns, which tell you where things are in space,
Right.
and orientation columns,
All right.
which respond to like specific edges and lines.
So it's breaking down the image into like its fundamental components then?
Exactly. And then it pieces it back together in a way that makes sense.
So it's not like there's a miniature version of the world
No.
projected onto our brains?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Much more abstract and analytical than that.
Okay.
And what's even more amazing is that even though the fovea,
Yeah.
you know, that tiny spot on the retina responsible for sharp vision,
Right.
it's minuscule compared to the rest of the visual field, right?
Right.
But it gets a disproportionate amount of brain real estate. It's like prime real estate in the brain.
Okay.
Dedicated to processing those high-resolution details.
That makes sense. We rely so much on our central vision
Yeah.
for things like reading, recognizing faces, interacting with objects.
Absolutely.
But here's a real brain teaser.
Okay.
Goldstein talks about this thing called the inverse projection problem.
Right.
What is that all about?
So think about it.
Okay.
A single image on our retina could be created by an infinite number of different objects.
Oh, wow.
In the real world.
Okay.
Right? Like a round shape could be a ball.
Right, a coin.
A coin, the sun, the setting sun, you name it.
Yeah.
So how does the brain know which one it's actually seeing?
That's a good question.
Right.
It's like trying to guess what's in a wrapped present.
Exactly.
Guess by feeling the outside.
Exactly.
There are like endless possibilities.
Endless possibilities, yeah.
Okay.
That's the inverse projection problem in a nutshell.
Okay.
Our brains are constantly having to solve this problem.
Wow.
Using context, past experiences, and a healthy dose of guesswork.
Really?
To figure out what's actually out there. It's a problem that still stumps even the most advanced computer vision systems.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's amazing what our brains are doing.
Yeah. How do we do it then?
Right.
What clues does the brain use to solve this puzzle?
Goldstein talks about these Gestalt principles of perceptual organization.
Okay.
They're like the brain's rule book
Okay.
for making sense of visual information.
Okay.
These principles are things like similarity, proximity, good continuation closure, figure ground segregation. All these things help our brains group visual elements into meaningful units and make sense of the chaos.
So instead of seeing like a jumble of lines and colors,
Right?
our brains are looking for patterns
Pattern.
and relationships.
Relationships, exactly.
Trying to find order in all the chaos.
Precisely.
Okay.
Take the principle of good continuation, for example.
Okay.
That explains why we see a rope as a single continuous strand.
Okay.
Even if it's partially hidden behind another object,
Right.
our brains prefer to perceive things as connected
Right.
and flowing smoothly,
Okay.
even when there are gaps in the sensory information.
So our brains are filling in the blanks, basically.
Filling in the blanks, exactly.
Creating a seamless visual experience,
Yeah.
even when the information is incomplete.
Yeah, you could say our brains are like masters of visual storytelling.
I like that.
Right.
And then there's figure ground segregation,
Right.
which is our ability to separate the main object or figure
Right.
from its background.
The background, exactly.
Around.
Yeah.
Think about those classic illusions
Yeah.
where you can either see a vase or two faces.
Right.
depending on what you focus on.
Exactly. That's figure ground segregation at play.
So our brains are constantly deciding what's important to focus on.
Yes.
And then what can just fade into the background.
Exactly.
It's not just what we see, but how we choose to see it too.
That's a great way to put it.
Wow, that's fascinating.
And here's another fascinating tidbit.
Okay.
Meaning matters.
Okay.
Research has shown that we're more likely to see a shape as the figure if it's something we recognize,
Okay.
something that has meaning for us.
So our past experiences,
Yeah.
our knowledge of the world.
Influences how we perceive things.
Wow.
In the present moment.
That's wild.
It is.
So it's almost like we're carrying around our own unique perceptual lens.
Yeah.
Then shaped by our experiences and our memories.
Exactly. And that lens influences not just how we see static images,
Right.
but also how we perceive motion.
It's not as simple as just things moving across our field of vision.
Right. Motion perception is much more complex than that.
Okay. Tell me more.
Well, have you ever stopped to think about how you actually perceive something moving?
Now that you mention it,
Yeah.
it is kind of weird.
It's not just that the image is moving across your retina, right?
Right. I could be looking straight ahead and still perceive motion in my peripheral vision.
Exactly. Goldstein introduces this concept of optic flow,
Okay.
which are the patterns of visual motion created by our own movement through the environment.
Okay.
It's crucial for things like walking, driving, even just navigating a crowded room.
So our brains are constantly analyzing the way the visual world flows around us,
Yeah.
using that information to guide our movements.
Precisely. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
We can actually perceive motion even when the image on our retina is perfectly still. Yeah, think about watching someone walk past you while you follow them with your eyes.
Okay.
Their image is relatively stable on your retina,
Right.
but you still perceive them as moving.
That's so weird.
That's where the corollary discharge theory comes in. It explains how the brain differentiates between self-generated motion,
right.
like moving your eyes, and actual motion in the environment.
Right.
So it's like your brain sends a copy of the move your eyes signal to the visual system,
Okay.
which then cancels out that self-generated motion.
So it cancels it out.
Yeah, allowing you to perceive the actual motion of the world around you.
So like our brains have this built-in system for filtering out the noise of our own movements.
It's incredible, right?
That's incredible.
And have you ever gently pushed on your eyelid
Okay.
and noticed that the world seems to jump?
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to have to try that later.
It's a fun little demonstration of the corollary discharge theory in action.
Okay.
So by pressing on your eyelid, you're manually moving your eyeball.
Right.
But your brain isn't sending out the usual move your eyes signal.
Right.
So it interprets that visual input as if the world itself is moving.
Oh, that's so cool.
Right.
It really highlights how active and dynamic our perception of motion is.
Exactly. It's not just about passively receiving visual information.
Right.
Our brains are actively constructing our experience of motion.
Right. And speaking of constructing our experience,
Yes.
Goldstein also delves into the fascinating world of visual illusions. Illusions, they're like these little cracks in the matrix, revealing the glitches in our perceptual systems.
Exactly. Illusions are like funhouse mirrors of the mind.
Okay.
Showing us where our brains tend to take shortcuts or make assumptions.
Right.
And by studying where our perceptions go wrong, we can actually learn a lot about the normal processes of perception.
Yeah. It's like those what's wrong with this picture puzzles.
Exactly.
By spotting the errors, you become more aware of the underlying patterns and rules.
Exactly like Goldstein talks about.
Okay.
How some illusions exploit the way our brains interpret depth cues.
Okay.
Like that famous Ames room illusion where
Right.
people seem to shrink or grow as they walk across a room.
Right. It looks like someone is magically changing size.
Right.
Before your eyes.
It messes with our sense of size constancy.
Okay.
This idea that we perceive objects as staying the same size.
Right.
Even when they're at different distances.
Okay.
The Ames room is cleverly distorted.
Okay.
So that our usual depth cues become misleading. And our brains end up misjudging the actual sizes of the people inside.
It's amazing how easily our brains can be tricked.
It is.
When we're presented with that kind of conflicting information.
For sure.
And it's not just about size and depth.
Right.
Goldstein also discusses illusions that kind of play with our perception of motion.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's the classic waterfall illusion, for example.
Right.
Have you ever stared at a waterfall for a while
I think so.
and then looked at a stationary object next to it?
Yeah. Remind me what happens.
Well, after staring at that downward motion of the waterfall,
Yeah.
that stationary object will actually appear to move upwards.
No way. Why does that happen?
It's called a motion after effect.
Okay.
Essentially, your brain adapts to the downward motion.
Right.
And then when you look at something stationary,
Yeah.
your visual system kind of overcompensates,
Oh.
creating this illusion of upward movement. It suggests that we have these specialized neurons for detecting different directions of motion.
Right.
And they can get a little fatigued
Oh.
after being exposed to the same movement for a while.
That's so cool.
It's worth experimenting with.
You have to try that out
Yeah.
next time I'm near a waterfall.
These illusions aren't just parlor tricks.
Right.
They reveal these fundamental principles
Okay.
about how our brains process visual information.
Right. They show us that our perception isn't this perfect,
Yes.
objective reflection of reality,
Yeah.
but rather this active construction
An active construction.
based on interpretation and inference.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really important point. If our brains are so easily tricked by illusions,
Yeah.
even with something as seemingly straightforward as vision,
Right.
how can we be sure of what's real?
Right.
How much of our perception is actually accurate,
Yeah.
and how much is just our brain's best guess?
That's a big question.
It is almost like a philosophical question.
Yeah.
But we're approaching it from the scientific perspective
Right.
of how our senses and brains work.
Right. And I think that's what makes Goldstein's book so fascinating.
Absolutely.
It doesn't shy away from these big questions.
It tackles them head on,
Right.
using the latest research
Yeah.
to really shed light on the mysteries of the human mind.
It's like we've been on this journey
Yeah.
through the sensory landscape of the brain,
Yes.
exploring how we see, how we hear,
How we perceive motion.
how we perceive motion.
Yeah.
And what we've kind of discovered is that reality, or
Yeah.
at least our experience of it.
Our experience of it is much more subjective and
Yeah.
much more constructed
Right.
than we might have realized.
And we might have realized.
Absolutely. It really underscores that perception is an active process,
Yeah.
not a passive one.
Right.
Our brains aren't just recording devices.
Right.
They're actively shaping and interpreting
Yeah.
the sensory information they receive,
Mhm.
constructing our unique experience of reality.
So we're each living in our own custom-built sensory worlds.
That's a great way to put it.
So where does that leave us then?
Right.
If we can't always trust our senses,
Yeah.
if our perception is so malleable,
Yeah.
how do we even navigate the world effectively?
That's where awareness comes in.
Okay.
By understanding how our senses work,
Mm-hmm.
how they can be fooled, how our brains construct our reality,
Right.
we can become more discerning observers of the world around us.
That makes sense.
We can learn to question our assumptions,
Yeah.
consider multiple perspectives,
Mm.
recognize that our own perception is just one interpretation among many.
It's like developing this critical lens
Yes.
on our own senses,
Exactly.
realizing that our brains are constantly making inferences,
Yeah.
filling in gaps.
And those inferences are shaped by our past experiences,
Right.
our expectations, even our emotional states.
Wow.
And this awareness,
Oh, yeah.
this perceptual literacy
Right.
is more important than ever in today's world, where we're bombarded with information from all sides.
Yeah, it's like we need to be able to sort through the sensory overload,
Exactly.
separate the signal from the noise,
Yes.
and really recognize that not everything we perceive
Yeah.
is an accurate reflection of reality.
I couldn't agree more.
By understanding these principles,
Yes.
we can become more critical thinkers,
Yes.
more informed consumers of information,
For sure.
and more aware of our own biases.
Absolutely.
It's empowering, really.
It is.
The more we understand about how our brains work,
Yeah.
the better equipped we are to kind of navigate
To navigate the world around us.
the complexities of the world around us.
For sure.
Well, I don't know about you, but my mind is officially blown.
Mine too.
It's amazing to think that all this incredible complexity
Yeah.
is happening inside our heads
Every single moment.
every single moment of our lives.
It's incredible.
And that's our deep dive for today.
Yes.
We hope this episode has left you with a newfound appreciation
Yes.
for the wonders of your own perception
Absolutely.
and perhaps a healthy dose of skepticism
Yes.
about what you think you know about the world.
For sure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning,
Yeah.
and keep those brains of yours buzzing.